I can't tell you how important this issue is, and sometimes we get lost in the verbiage that the State Department likes to often belabor. And I think, I'm going to let the attorneys here focus on some of the language and the impact that can have from a legal perspective. But just since I'm the first speaker, what we're talking about is UN Resolution 1618, or the Istanbul process. That is basically the evolution of every year. There's been this annual discussion at the UN of blasphemy and of discussion of Islamophobia and other concepts that even the term Islamophobia you'll find I rarely use because I just don't like it. It's a term that I find as a Muslim offensive because it basically is a method in which to suppress as hate speech any type of disagreement with the power structure within the Islamist organizations. And if you look at UN Resolution 1618, the State Department was all very proud of it because all of a sudden they went from defamation to this language of combating intolerance, negative stereotyping, and stigmatization of and discrimination, incitement to violence, and violence against persons based on religion or belief. So the State Department was proud of this because it basically, they feel, applies to American law, and they cite Brandenburg versus Ohio, which basically says that all speech is okay and that this doesn't limit free speech because ultimately it only punishes or claims to be criminal any type of speech that results in or promotes acts of violence. And I'll tell you, as a Muslim, what's amazing is that this is almost like trying to do a cause and effect analysis that based on a post-mortem of some act of violence, if they can prove that a speech, some speech caused it, that all of a sudden that becomes hate speech. And this post-mortem type of discussion and suppression of speech, I think, is very interesting. And what I'd like to do is approach this, if you look at who the OIC is and what they're trying to do in the UN, the whole pretext of it is just amazing to me that when you talk to the State Department about this, their responses nationally in some of the writings to those of us that have disagreed with this whole process, their responses have been that this doesn't violate American law. Who said American law is at issue here? You have an Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is 57 countries, that never even signed the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Their entire operating mechanism is the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights, which is based on their interpretation of Sharia or Islamic law, and I think is an abomination to Western values. So here you have a group of countries that votes in bloc that is driving this whole process, this Istanbul process, that we're trying to appease, and they are pushing and using our own values where they're not even accountable within their own country. And what's interesting is how we consistently are playing defense. And then people say, where are the moderate voices of Islam? And how can we have a voice if even our own country, which is non-Muslim in majority, responds to these issues by playing defense and helping facilitate a whole conversation about what we do and speech that may happen in the United States that may result, or in the West, that may result in acts of violence, when in fact, ultimately, it prevents the entire discussion that we need to have, which is what is the status of free speech, what is the status of freedom of religion within the OIC countries themselves. And you have countries that many of us consider to be a cartel or a mafia of organizations that are abominations to freedoms, that the Democracy Index from 2010 said that only 3 of the 57 countries were rated as flawed democracies. The rest were authoritarian regimes or hybrid regimes. And they refused to sign the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So how can countries that wouldn't even sign that declaration then be a party to language that ultimately uses the UN Declaration and Western constitutional principles? It's anathema that just doesn't make any sense. And the other thing is that it empowers these countries, when you center the discussion about Islam and Muslims and hate speech, etc., it empowers them to be the de facto representatives of Muslims. And in fact, that's what the OIC claims itself to be, which is the representatives of the Muslim Ummah or the Muslim community, but that word also means nation state. And ultimately, I consider them to be a neo-caliphate, which is they don't claim to be a caliphate, but basically they're an organization that has one thing in common. And I'd love to see our State Department say, well, we're going to form the Organization of Christian Conference, and or other faith communities form an organization, which would be an anathema to our Western principles, but yet nobody seems to call them on that. And yet reformers within their countries, of these Muslim countries, for example, don't get a voice, and their voices get snuffed out because it's interesting. One of the heads of ISNA, one of the main people on their board, the Islamic Society of North America, wrote in IslamOnline.net, which is one of the most frequented Muslim Brotherhood websites. He talked about apostasy. And Jamal Badawi made a statement about apostasy in which he said that basically apostasy is crimes against the state in which speech degrades the stability of the state. So it's interesting that they claim that there's no laws against apostasy in Islam, these so-called leaders of the Islamic community, but yet they say that in Muslim majority countries, if you criticize Islam or if you criticize the government, they equate sedition in an Islamic state with speech against Islam because Islam is the faith of the community and the faith of the government. So it's interesting that all of a sudden what they would determine within their own countries to be against Islam or Islamophobic, etc., could end up being targeted as sedition, targeted as not necessarily, they may say it's not defamation or blasphemy laws, but actually it ends up being speech against the state and ends up criminalizing free speech against their own governments. And that's how they empowered. And that's why if you look at the Cairo Declaration, I would ask all of you to look it up from 1990 and what they signed. It is very interesting to see that the laws they apply within their own country have no compatibility with this Istanbul process and what they're talking about. So I think this is what's just, a travesty, is that we get muddled down into this whole process, as we're going to talk about the language of it, and yet in their own countries, they have huge barriers against free speech, and organizations in the United States, like the Islamic Society of North America, Council on American Islamic Relations, use this in order to foment the concept that Muslims are attacked, America and the West are anti-Muslim, and this concept that we have to fight against this boogeyman of Islamophobia, which doesn't even make sense because Islam is a concept, it's an idea, it's a faith. You can't really be phobic against the concept. But yet that's what they want to promote. And ultimately, let me give you one aspect of what the OIC defines as terrorism. They say any act or threat of violence carried out with the aim of, among other things, imperiling people's honor, occupying or seizing public or private property, or threatening the stability, territorial integrity, political unity, or sovereignty of a state. So basically, here you have a group of countries that their own definition of terrorism is a way to suppress any free speech in their own societies. And if you look, Syria, which is the country my parents came from, now, our hearts go out to all the courage of what's happening in Syria on a daily basis and the devastation that that government is wreaking on its people on a daily basis. And yet, you see that these governments, what are they saying the people are doing, the uprising? They're calling them terrorists. So the OIC's definition of terrorism is actually people who seek to express themselves against the government and destabilize what they consider to be the order of the society. And I think it's interesting, and we need to ask ourselves, and I find it embarrassing as an American, that the State Department doesn't ask themselves publicly what made a bunch of corrupt autocracies become the spokespeople in countries for Muslims and Islam. And why don't we actually, when they signed the Cairo Declaration, we should have separated them from the UN and said that they need to be, if they're going to be part of the UN and vote in bloc, they need to be part of the UN Declaration, but yet they did not do that. They feel that the UN Declaration of Human Rights is a Judeo-Christian secular document, is actually what the declaration they signed tells us. And I think ultimately, in my last minute here, the strategy of what this Istanbul process is to keep the West in defense and basically say that states deeply concerned about the incidents of intolerance and Islamophobia actually then take this process in order to tell the West that they are anti-Muslim and anti-Islamic and causing acts of hatred against Muslims within their societies. And never look within Saudi Arabia, never look within Iran, never look within Syria in order to actually see what happens in Muslim majority countries, which I think is bizarre, that where Muslims usually live, which is in the Muslim majority countries, nobody holds them to task about Islamophobia against liberal Muslims, etc. But yet in Muslim minority countries, we're playing defense on this. So it's interesting that, what's the impact of this? Look what's happening in New York City recently. We just have spent the last 2 weeks responding to the New York Times report after report after report about a film that I participated in with the Clarion Fund and narrated called The Third Jihad, that basically lays out what the plan of the Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups are in the United States and in the West, and why they're here basically not to learn American values, but rather to evangelize their Islamic doctrine, control our societies, and speak for our communities. And basically anybody that puts a movie out that talks about the security threat, that terrorism is not the problem, but rather political Islam and Islamism is the problem, then gets targeted as being hateful. And the film was targeted by the New York Times as being hateful, when in fact they're telling me as a devout, conservative, family-oriented Muslim that I'm a hate monger, which basically ends up saying that I'm outside the house of Islam. And that's takfir, right? In Islam it means that I'm an apostate. So all of these things run together. And the New York Times basically, you know, I'll tell you, I really don't think, and the mayor and others that have been critical of this movie, I don't think they really care about Islamism and all these things. They just care about using Muslims to target the right. And that ultimately it's left versus right, it's a political partisan battle, and Muslims end up being sort of lost in the middle, forget what we're trying to do for reform, forget what we're trying to do for national security and against groups like the OIC. And ultimately, they end up doing the same thing that Al-Qaeda did to me 2 weeks ago. If you look at memory, you'll see there was an Al-Qaeda jihadist website that targeted me as being the Satan and working with the West and conspiracy theories and other things, and that ultimately the Syrian opposition needs to beware of Zuhdi Jasser because I'm, you know, and they cited of all things, the worst thing I ever wrote was that Muslims need to be punished who don't want to fight with the U.S. Armed Forces against Iraq or in Iraq or Afghanistan, because of treason and that they should not be offered conscientious objection. And it's interesting that this is the core issue, and if the State Department doesn't get it, they are jeopardizing our security. And I think I can't express enough, there are other Muslims out there. We have an American Islamic Leadership Coalition that has formed, includes over 20 organizations, and we just need courageous government people, State Department and others, to stand behind us and give us a platform. We may appear to be a minority right now, but even in the best elections, the Islamists only win because the secularists are so divided. If the secularists united, they would, I think, have a majority of the vote in many of these countries. But we can't win if the West continues to empower thugs and autocracies like the OIC.